I am resigning from the Bureau of Cultural Integration, effective immediately, and before anyone on the review board dismisses this as fatigue or a stress reaction, I need you to understand something. I have spent 140 years conducting field observations across 39 species. I have sat in the spawning chambers of the Hruel while they devoured their weak. I have walked the tunnels of the Yenthian hive network during a queen transfer, surrounded by 10,000 soldiers who could have liquefied me with a single collective shriek. I have observed the Korvathi during their blood ascension rituals, standing close enough to feel the heat of the ceremonial pyres on my skin. I have never once requested early extraction. I have never filed a distress addendum. I have never lost a single night of rest over anything I observed in the field. In 140 years, across 39 species, my professional composure has never once cracked. That record ended 6 weeks ago, on a human station at the edge of their solar territory, and it will never recover. None of us will recover. What I am about to describe is not an anomaly. It is not an isolated event. It is not a warning about what humans might become under stress or provocation. It is a clinical account of what they already are, on a quiet day, and every species on this council needs to hear it before the membership vote proceeds. It started the way all observation missions start, with a briefing in the council chamber and a thick folder of preliminary intelligence. Except the folder was not thick. That should have been my first warning. Humanity had petitioned for full membership in the Galactic Council, a routine request that we receive from aspiring species every few decades. Standard procedure required a 5-member observation team to embed among the candidate species for 30 standard rotations, compile a comprehensive cultural compatibility index, and present findings to the full assembly. I had done this dozens of times. It was the work I was built for. I assembled my team personally, selecting each member for their expertise and their temperament under pressure. Peleth was my xenobiologist, a Sorvan from the Central Institute, widely regarded as the finest biological analyst in active service. She had cataloged the physiology of 22 species, and had published definitive studies on pain response thresholds across the galactic mammalian spectrum. Nothing biological surprised her. Dosk was my military behaviorist, a Kethvari with 63 confirmed combat engagements, decorated twice for valor during the Korvathi border conflicts, and possessed of a professional calm that I had never seen waver in any circumstance. The Kethvari are a warrior species. They measure status by scars. Dosk had enough scars to fill a museum. Nellie was my social structure analyst, a meticulous researcher who had mapped the governance hierarchies of 11 species and could predict institutional behavior patterns with uncanny accuracy. And Koramith was my linguistic attaché, fluent in 19 galactic languages, a specialist in cultural subtext and communicative intent who could decode the hidden meaning beneath almost any form of expression. It was the strongest team I had ever assembled, and I was proud of them. I thought we were prepared for anything the galaxy could produce. The bureau director, a tall Marethan named Sothal, handed me the preliminary file on humanity and walked us through the basics. Bipedal carbon-based mammals, single planet of origin, relatively young spacefaring civilization, nothing remarkable on paper. Then, as we were leaving the briefing room, Sothal mentioned something. He delivered it casually, the way one might mention that the weather had been unusual lately. 3 previous scout ships, he said, had been sent to human space over the past decade as part of preliminary reconnaissance. 2 had returned early. Their crews refused to file reports. Not declined, refused. They accepted the professional consequences, the marks on their records, the mandatory review hearings, rather than document what they had seen. The 3rd crew completed their mission, but immediately requested psychological reassignment to non-contact administrative roles. All 3 crews were subsequently evaluated by bureau psychiatrists. None of them were found to be mentally unfit. They were simply unwilling to discuss their experience, and the bureau, lacking grounds for compulsion, had let the matter drop. Sothal told me this with a faint shrug, as though it were a curiosity and nothing more. I treated it accordingly. 3 crews with weak constitutions. It happened. I had observed predator species before. I had observed species that consumed their own dead as a nutritional strategy. I had observed species that communicated through controlled bursts of radiation strong enough to cook an unshielded observer from the inside out. Whatever the humans were, I was confident my training, my experience, and my team could handle them. I signed the commission and scheduled our departure for the following morning. Looking back, I recognized that confidence for what it was. It was not courage. It was ignorance. And ignorance, when you are walking toward humans, is not a shield. It is a countdown. We arrived at Terran Station Jericho on what the humans called a Wednesday. The station occupied a stable orbit above a barren moon at the outer edge of human territorial space. A diplomatic waypoint built specifically for interspecies exchange. From the outside, it looked unremarkable. A cylindrical structure roughly 3 kilometers long, bristling with communications arrays and docking ports, rotating slowly to generate internal gravity. Nothing about its exterior suggested anything unusual. The interior was a different matter. When our ship docked and the airlock pressurized, the first thing I noticed was the weight. The gravity on the station was calibrated to what humans call 1G, the standard gravitational pull of their homeworld. My species evolved at roughly 0.5 G. Stepping onto that station felt like someone had draped a thick, wet blanket across my entire body and then sat on my shoulders. Every step required conscious effort. My joints protested. My spine compressed. Peleth, whose skeletal structure was even lighter than mine, winced visibly and placed a hand against the corridor wall to steady herself. Dosk managed better, being built heavier, but even he adjusted his stance, lowering his center of gravity the way he did before entering a combat zone. The second thing I noticed was the light. The station's interior lighting simulated something the humans called daylight, a blazing, full-spectrum assault that made my eyes water and forced Koromith to activate his secondary optical membranes just to navigate the corridor. The air was dense and rich with oxygen, warmer than any environment I had worked in, and every surface hummed with energy systems running at output levels that seemed wildly excessive for a station of this size. Our liaison was waiting at the end of the docking corridor. Her name was Commander Nora Beckett, a mid-ranking diplomatic officer with short dark hair, sharp pale eyes, and a posture so relaxed it bordered on carelessness. She smiled when she saw us. I cataloged this behavior immediately. Humans bare their teeth as a greeting and bonding gesture. The expression is called a smile, and it is apparently meant to communicate warmth, welcome, and non-threatening intent. I understood this intellectually. My body, however, which had been shaped by several 100,000 years of evolution to interpret the sight of a predator displaying its teeth as an immediate threat, reacted accordingly. My pulse spiked. My peripheral vision sharpened. I felt the flight instinct press against the base of my skull like a cold hand, and I had to consciously override it before I could respond to her greeting. Beckett was gracious. She introduced herself, shook each of our hands, a physical greeting custom that involved gripping another being's manipulator appendage and moving it up and down with firm pressure, and told us that the station commander had cleared our full itinerary. We were free to go anywhere on the station, observe any operation, ask any question of any crew member, and access any database in the station's archive without restriction. No classified areas, no sealed files, no supervised zones, no escort requirements. She said this casually, the way one might offer directions to a dining hall, and I remember the silence that followed as my team processed the implications. In 140 years of observation work, across 39 species, every single one had imposed restrictions on what we could see. Every single one. The Hrul forbade us from entering their command warrens and would not explain why. The Korvathi blacked out entire sections of their military archives and posted armed guards at the doors. The Yenthians sealed their queen's chamber and required us to submit our notes for review before we could transmit them off-world. Even the Palani, who prided themselves on their transparency and cultural openness, kept their breeding records and genetic selection protocols under diplomatic seal. Every species, without exception, had something to hide and took steps to hide it. Humans placed no limits whatsoever. They handed us the keys to everything and told us to enjoy ourselves. I did not find this reassuring. I found it deeply, fundamentally suspicious, because a species with nothing to hide is a species that does not believe you can use what you find against them, and that implied a level of confidence that I was not prepared to confront. That first night, after we had been shown to our quarters, adjusted the gravity in our rooms to something survivable, and eaten a meal from our own supplies because we were not yet brave enough to try human food, I sat down at the data terminal the humans had provided and opened their historical archive. They had given us full access, as promised. The database was vast, meticulously organized, and completely unredacted. Billions of files spanning thousands of their years. I selected an entry at random from their modern military history section. It was labeled with a designation that translated roughly as World War II. I read for 4 hours without stopping. I could not stop. I learned about a conflict that consumed their entire planet. Not a border dispute between neighboring territories. Not a resource skirmish over a contested asteroid belt. A war that spread across every continent and every ocean of their homeworld, that mobilized entire civilian populations for industrial-scale production of weapons, that killed tens of millions of their own kind through combat, starvation, disease, systematic extermination, and the deliberate, calculated targeting of civilian population centers. I read about campaigns fought in frozen wastelands where humans froze to death in their fighting positions, and their comrades climbed over the rigid bodies to keep advancing toward the enemy. I read about aerial bombardments that reduced entire cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, to rubble and ash in a single night. I read about naval engagements fought across oceans so vast they dwarfed the largest bodies of water on any council homeworld. I read about something called the Holocaust, a systematic, industrialized, bureaucratically managed program of extermination carried out by one group of humans against another, not in the chaos of battle, but with schedules and transport logistics and purpose-built facilities designed for the efficient processing of death. And then, I read about how the rest of the humans stopped it, how they crossed those vast oceans in ships and aircraft, stormed fortified coastlines under withering fire, fought through hedgerows and forests and bombed out cities and frozen mountain passes, and dismantled the machinery of extermination piece by piece, at a cost of millions of their own lives, because they decided that what was happening was unacceptable, and that stopping it was worth any price. I closed the file. I sat in the dark for a very long time. Dosk found me an hour later. He had been reading the same archive from his own terminal. He stood in my doorway, his heavy Kethvari frame filling the space, his tail low and still, which in his species indicates deep unease. He said nothing for nearly a full minute. I could hear him breathing. Then he spoke. "I would like to request a sidearm," he said. His voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a professional managing a reaction he did not want me to see. I told him that observation teams do not carry weapons. It was regulation. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a Kethvari face before, something that lived in the space between frustration and genuine fear, and said, "I am aware of the regulation. I am making the request anyway." I denied it. He stood there a moment longer, then left without another word. I heard his heavy footsteps recede down the corridor, and then silence. I opened my official log and typed my first entry. Day 1 complete. Initial impressions. The humans appear cooperative and transparent. Confidence in cultural compatibility index assessment remains moderate. I closed the log and opened my private journal, the unofficial one that no review board would ever see, the one I kept for myself, and I wrote 2 words. They remember everything. And they gave us those memories voluntarily, as though the darkest chapters of their history were simply context, background material. A polite orientation packet for visitors. I turned off the terminal, lay down on the too firm human mattress that the station had provided, stared at the ceiling in the crushing gravity, and did not sleep for the rest of the night. The first week moved fast, and every day peeled back a new layer that I wished had stayed buried. On the 3rd morning, Peleth began her biological observation at the station's medical facility. She had spent 2 days reviewing human physiology files and was already unsettled by what she had found on paper, but she maintained her professional composure and requested a live observation of standard medical procedures. The chief medical officer, a calm, gray-haired human named Dr. Sam Garrett, agreed immediately and gave her a dedicated workstation in the corner of the primary treatment bay. He seemed pleased by her interest. He answered her preliminary questions with the patience of a natural teacher and provided her with access to every piece of medical equipment in the facility. He had nothing to hide. None of them ever did. She did not have to wait long for a case study. 40 minutes into her first observation session, a maintenance crew member was brought in on a hovering stretcher. A structural support beam had come loose during a repair operation in the station's lower decks and had driven clean through the man's midsection. The beam had been removed at the scene by his fellow crew members, and what arrived in the medical bay was a human male, roughly 30 years old, with a puncture wound through his abdomen, large enough for Peleth to see the table beneath him through the gap in his torso. He was conscious. He was lucid. He was looking up at the ceiling with an expression that Peleth initially classified as shock, but later reclassified as irritation. As the medical team surrounded him and began their assessment, the man lifted his head, looked at Dr. Garrett, and said, and I am quoting directly from Peleth's report, because she recorded the exchange, "Tell my shift supervisor, I am going to be late for the afternoon rotation." Then he laughed. He laughed with a hole through his body. The sound was rough and cut short by pain, but it was unmistakably laughter, the human involuntary response to perceived absurdity. Peleth watched the surgical team work for 3 hours. They cut him open further to access the damaged organs, widening the wound with deliberate incisions. They repaired torn intestinal tissue, sealed ruptured blood vessels with microcauterization tools, reinforced cracked vertebrae with synthetic bone compound, and rebuilt a section of his digestive tract using cloned biological material that the medical bay apparently kept in stock for exactly this kind of situation. The man survived. He was conscious and speaking again within 6 hours, complaining about the quality of the recovery ward food. Dr. Garrett told Peleth that he would be back on active duty within 6 weeks, possibly sooner if he was diligent with his physical therapy. Peleth asked what physical therapy was. Garrett explained that it was a structured program of progressive exercise and controlled physical stress, designed to rebuild damaged muscle, restore range of motion, and strengthen the injury site beyond its pre-injury baseline. The human would voluntarily subject himself to weeks of deliberate discomfort, carefully calibrated pain, in order to force his body to repair itself faster and come back stronger than it had been before the injury. Peleth returned to her quarters that evening and compiled her first biological addendum. I read it before I went to bed. Her hands had been shaking when she typed it. I could see the uneven spacing and occasional transposed characters in the original text. Human pain tolerance, she wrote, is not a fixed threshold that, once exceeded, results in system failure. It is a managed spectrum that the organism navigates consciously, adjusting behavioral and cognitive responses in real time, based on strategic assessment of the situation. They do not merely endure pain, they make decisions about it. They evaluate its source, its severity, its likely duration, and its relevance to their immediate goals. And then they choose how much of it to acknowledge. They have documented cases of humans performing surgical procedures on themselves in wilderness environments, with no anesthesia, using improvised tools. They have records of humans amputating their own trapped limbs with cutting implements to escape life-threatening entrapment. They have accounts of soldiers continuing to fight in combat with injuries that would render any council species biologically non-functional, operating on adrenaline and conscious will alone for hours beyond what any medical model would predict as possible. They do not survive despite their injuries. They incorporate injury into their operational parameters and continue functioning. I read that paragraph 3 times. Then I closed the file, stared at the wall of my quarters, and tried to reconcile what I had just read with the smiling, handshaking, casually friendly species I had been observing for 3 days. I could not do it. The two images would not merge, and I was beginning to understand that the gap between them was not a contradiction. It was the point. The following day, Dosk and I accompanied Commander Beckett on a tour of the station's recreational facilities. I expected something routine, perhaps a social gathering space with comfortable seating and entertainment screens. Perhaps a media library or a game room, something that would tell us what humans did with their leisure time. Instead, Beckett led us through a reinforced door, the kind of door you see on military installations, into a cavernous chamber filled with equipment that I initially mistook for industrial machinery. She called it a gymnasium. Inside, Off-duty crew members were engaged in activities that Beckett described as exercise. They were lifting enormous metal objects over their heads, cylinders loaded with flat discs of increasing weight, driving them upward with their legs and backs and arms, their faces contorted with effort, their muscles visibly straining beneath their skin, sweat running down their bodies. They were running on machines that simulated endless stretches of terrain, pumping their legs at speeds that would constitute a dead sprint for most council species, and sustaining this pace for durations that Beckett said could exceed an hour. In one corner, a group of humans were striking padded surfaces with their bare fists, their bare shins, their elbows and knees. Each strike landed with a heavy, percussive impact that I could hear from across the room, a sound like stone hitting stone. The padded surfaces were thick and dense, and designed to absorb punishment, and the humans were delivering that punishment with visible enthusiasm. In another area, two humans were engaged in something Beckett called sparring. They were fighting each other, grappling, throwing, applying joint locks and submission holds with controlled precision. One of them was a female officer, roughly half the mass of her opponent. She moved with a speed and technical fluency that stopped Dosk mid-stride. His tail went rigid. His claws, which he kept retracted as a courtesy aboard the station, pressed against the inside of their sheaths. In Kethvari body language, these are signs of extreme alertness, the posture of a predator that has identified something it is not certain it can defeat. The female officer executed a sweeping throw that put her larger opponent on the ground, transitioned immediately to a hold that immobilized his arm, and maintained it until he tapped the mat in surrender. Then she helped him up. They touched fists in what appeared to be a gesture of mutual respect, and they reset to do it again. I asked Beckett how often the crew engaged in these activities. She said most personnel trained 4 to 6 times per standard week, which meant nearly every day. Some trained every single day without exception. I asked what they were training for. She looked at me with genuine puzzlement, her brow furrowed slightly, as though the question itself did not quite make sense to her, and said, "Nothing specific. We just like to stay ready." Ready for what? I wanted to ask, but I already knew the answer. Ready for anything. Ready for everything. Ready, because readiness itself was the point. Because for humans, the distinction between peace and war was not a wall, but a door, and they kept themselves in condition to walk through it at any moment. Dosk did not speak for the remainder of the tour. That evening, we observed a communal meal in the station's primary dining facility. The atmosphere was warm, almost festive. Humans gathered in clusters around long tables, sharing food from common dishes, telling stories, laughing at things I could not follow, but that Koromith, still trying to decode the layers of human speech, identified as jokes. A form of performative narrative, designed to trigger an involuntary pleasure response. The lighting was softer than the corridor lights. The noise level was high but pleasant. It felt, for the first time since we had arrived, almost safe, almost normal. I began to relax. Then a loud exchange erupted between two crew members at a table near the serving line. Their voices rose sharply, cutting through the ambient noise like a crack in glass. Their bodies tensed, their hands clenched into fists at their sides. One of them, a large male with broad shoulders and a red face, leaned forward across the table. The other, a lean woman with close-cropped hair, stood up from her seat, her chair scraping back against the floor, with a sound that silenced the nearest tables. Every biological indicator I had been trained to read, across 39 species and 140 years of observation, told me that physical violence was imminent. The elevated vocal pitch, the rigid posture, the clenched hands, the forward lean, the fixed eye contact. In any other species I had observed, this sequence led to one outcome. I braced for impact. Inelli grabbed my arm. Peleth took a step backward. Dosk shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, a defensive stance so practiced it was reflexive. Nothing happened. The two humans stared at each other for a long, terrible, suspended moment. Then the woman said something short and hard, a single sentence delivered through clenched teeth that I could not hear clearly from across the room. The man held her gaze for 2 more seconds. Then he exhaled, shook his head, turned around and walked away. The woman sat back down, picked up her utensil, and resumed eating. Within 2 minutes, the ambient conversation in the dining hall had returned to its previous level. as though nothing at all had occurred. No one else had intervened. No one had even stood up. A confrontation that in any council species would have resulted in violence had been resolved through nothing more than mutual decision, a shared, unspoken agreement that the situation did not warrant escalation. I asked Beckett about it later. She shrugged, a human gesture of casual dismissal that I had come to recognize as one of the most unsettling movements in their physical vocabulary, because it meant they considered something negligible. People disagree sometimes, she said. That is completely normal. I pressed her. The confrontation had exhibited every precursor to physical violence I had ever catalogued across nearly 4 decades of species. How had it ended so quickly? She considered this for a moment, tilting her head slightly, and then said something that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. We have learned, she said, that punching someone over a scheduling disagreement is not worth the paperwork. She delivered it as a joke. She expected me to smile. I could not smile. Because what I had just witnessed was not de-escalation. It was not conflict avoidance. It was not pacifism. It was something far more significant. Two humans, both clearly capable of violence, both clearly angry enough to engage in it, had made a conscious, real-time decision that violence was not the optimal response to their situation. They had evaluated the cost and the benefit in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and they had chosen restraint, not from weakness. From calculation. They were not beings who could not fight. They were beings who chose, moment by moment, whether to fight. And they made that choice with a speed and sophistication that turned every encounter with them into a negotiation you did not know you were having. Dosk did not speak during dinner. He did not speak when we returned to our quarters. That night, late, he came to my room. He stood in the doorway again, the same way he had on the first night, and this time, he did not ask for a weapon. He said something worse. I have been in 63 combat engagements, he said. I have faced the Hruel charge. I have survived a Yenthian ambush swarm. I stood on the walls of Korvath during the siege of their southern capital, and held my position for 9 days without reinforcement. He paused, and in that pause, I heard something I had never heard from a Kethvari in my entire life. Uncertainty. The humans frighten me, he said. Not because of what they do, because of what they do not do. Because of what they clearly could do and choose not to. They are holding back, Vreth. Every moment of every day, they are holding back. And we have absolutely no idea what the full measure looks like. I wrote my official log entry. Day 7. Team morale adequate. Observations proceeding within normal parameters. Then I opened my private journal and wrote what I could not put in any official document. They are not aggressive. They are not passive. They are something we do not have a classification for. They are patient. And patience, in a species with this much capacity for destruction, is the most terrifying trait I have ever catalogued. By the second week, my team had split into individual research tracks, each following their own line of inquiry, and each returning to me with findings that made the previous day's discoveries seem manageable by comparison. Yaneli was the first to break. She had requested access to the human cultural archives, specifically their records of social organization, governance structures, and institutional development. Beckett granted the request without hesitation, the same way she granted everything, with that easy, almost cheerful confidence of someone who genuinely believed they had nothing to fear from scrutiny. Yaneli settled into a research terminal in the station's library and began her analysis. She expected dry institutional records, legislative frameworks, census data, taxation models, the bureaucratic skeleton of a civilization, which was her specialty and which she could usually dissect and categorize within a few days. Instead, she fell into a canyon she did not know existed. She came to me on the 14th day, moving fast, her normally composed features rearranged into an expression I had never seen on her face. It was not fear exactly, it was the look of someone who has discovered that the room they are standing in is much larger than they thought, and that the walls are much further away, and that there might not be walls at all. They invent stories, she said. As though reporting an emergency, I blinked. Every species tells stories. Origin myths, historical narratives, instructional parables. This was not unusual. Yaneli shook her head so hard, her cranial tendrils whipped back and forth. Not like this, she said. They invent entire worlds, entire civilizations, entire futures and pasts that have never happened, and will never happen. They write detailed accounts of societies that do not exist, wars that were never fought, technologies that have not been invented, and they do this constantly. Not their scholars or their leaders. Everyone. Millions of them. For entertainment. She had stumbled into a category of human cultural production called fiction, and within fiction, a subcategory called science fiction. She had spent 3 days reading without rest, her meals untouched on the tray beside her terminal. She showed me 2 works. The first was a narrative about a totalitarian government that controlled its population through constant surveillance, the systematic manipulation of language and truth, and the erasure of historical memory. It was called 1984, and it had been written by a single human decades before such a society existed, as a warning. A warning they built from pure imagination, and then distributed to their entire population so that everyone would recognize the signs. The second was about a society that maintained control not through force, but through pleasure, distraction, and the voluntary surrender of critical thinking. Then she showed me the section that broke her. She had accessed a subcategory of fiction the humans called alien invasion stories. This was where she lost her composure entirely, and I cannot blame her, because when she explained what she had found, I lost mine as well. Humans have spent more than a century, she said, her voice climbing in pitch, imagining every possible way an extraterrestrial civilization might attack them. They have written thousands of narratives about first contact with alien species, and in those narratives, they have systematically, exhaustively, obsessively explored every conceivable scenario. Hostile military invasion from orbit, biological contamination, cultural infiltration, technological theft, diplomatic manipulation, resource extraction, genetic absorption, parasitic infection, psychological warfare, economic subjugation. For every single scenario, they have imagined responses, countermeasures, victory conditions. They have gamed out wars with enemies that did not exist, using threat models built from nothing but imagination, and they have been doing this for generations. She grabbed my arm, which was something Yaneli had never done before. They are not unprepared for us, she said. They have been preparing for something like us since before they knew we existed. Every possible version of us. Every possible threat we might represent. Every angle of attack. They have already fought us 1,000 times in their minds, and they have already won most of those fights. The rest, they are still working on. I sat with that information for a long time after she left. I thought about the bureau director, Sothal, and his casual mention of the 3 scout crews who refused to file reports. I wondered if those crews had found these same archives. I wondered if they had read the same stories. I wondered if they had looked into the mirror of human imagination and seen themselves reflected back as the enemy in a war the humans had already rehearsed. I thought the answer was yes, and I understood, for the first time, why they had refused to talk about it. 6 days later, the station alarm sounded without warning. Not the scheduled drill. This was different. My team had been in the observation lounge reviewing notes when every light in the room shifted to a deep amber, and a sound like a massive resonant horn filled every corridor on the station. My immediate assumption was catastrophe. An attack. A hull breach. Something had gone terribly wrong. Pelith dropped her tablet and dove under the nearest table, a reflex from her childhood on Sorvon, where ground tremors were common. Koromith froze in place, his optical membranes cycling rapidly. Yaneli pressed herself flat against the wall, instinctively reducing her profile. Dosk dropped into a combat crouch, his claws fully extended for the first time since we had boarded the station. His massive body coiled and ready to strike at whatever came through the door. What came through the door was Beckett, calm as a still pond, moving at a brisk but unhurried pace. She told us it was a scheduled emergency drill, a practice exercise, a rehearsal. They were rehearsing for disaster, the way other species rehearse for ceremonies. She led us to an observation gallery overlooking the station's primary operations deck, and we watched what unfolded below. The entire station, every department, every section, Every individual crew member from the commanding officer to the lowest-ranked maintenance tech transitioned from standard peacetime operation to full combat readiness in under 4 minutes. Bulkheads sealed with heavy, definitive impacts that echoed through the hull. Weapon systems I had not known existed powered up beneath the station's skin. I could feel the vibration through the floor as power was rerouted from civilian systems to defensive networks, a surge of energy flowing through hidden conduits to feed mechanisms that had been dormant and invisible for the entire duration of our visit. Crew members who moments ago had been eating meals, filing reports, reading books, and telling jokes now moved through the corridors with terrifying precision, each one flowing to their assigned station without hesitation, without confusion, without a single wasted step. They did not run. They did not shout. They walked with controlled purpose, every movement rehearsed to the point of unconscious reflex. And then I saw the children. There were families on this station. I had known this intellectually, had noted it in my preliminary observations as a cultural data point. Humans bring their families with them even to frontier postings, but I had not fully processed what that meant until I watched a line of human children, some no older than 6 or 7 standard years, file into a reinforced shelter pod in orderly silence. They were not crying. They were not frightened. A few of the younger ones held the hands of older children, and an adult educator walked at the rear of the line with a calm, reassuring presence. But the children themselves moved with the practiced efficiency of beings who had done this many times before. They knew the route. They knew the procedure. They knew their place in line. A small girl, perhaps 7 years old, walking near the end of the line, passed by the observation gallery and noticed me through the reinforced glass. She must have seen the distress on my face, the wide eyes, the rigid posture, the shallow breathing, because she stopped. She stopped in the middle of a combat readiness drill, turned to face me, pressed her small hand flat against the glass, and said, loud enough for me to hear through the intercom channel, "Do not worry, it is just a drill. The real ones are louder." She said it kindly. She was comforting me. A 7-year-old human child was comforting a 140-year-old senior cultural assessor because she could see that I was scared and she was not. She had grown up in a civilization that rehearsed for catastrophe so routinely that a child could distinguish between practice alarms and real ones by the volume of the sirens. The drill concluded in 6 minutes. The station returned to normal operations as smoothly as it had departed from them. The children emerged from the shelters and went back to their schooling. The crew resumed their duties. Beckett asked if we had any questions, the same way she might ask if we wanted refills on our drinks. I had 1,000 questions. I could not form a single one of them into words. I asked Beckett how often they conducted these drills. "Twice a month at the station-wide level," she said. "Department-level exercises, weekly. Individual crew members ran personal readiness checks daily, on their own time, without being ordered to." I asked whether the children participated in every drill. She looked at me as though the question were strange. "Of course," she said, "they live here. They need to know what to do." She paused and added, almost gently, "It would be irresponsible not to include them." I stood there, processing the idea that in human culture, teaching your children to survive catastrophe was considered a fundamental parental obligation, as natural as teaching them to eat or speak. They were not raising children in a safe environment. They were raising children who could survive an unsafe one. There is a difference, and it is vast. And it kept me awake that night staring at the ceiling of my quarters, while the station hummed peacefully around me, a fortress disguised as a home, populated by people who had learned to tell the difference between the sound of practice death and real death before they lost their first baby teeth. That same week, Koromith came to me with his own rupture. The linguistic attaché had been struggling with human communication since our arrival. Their primary language on this station, a system called English, operated on multiple simultaneous levels that defied his training. The literal surface meaning of their words frequently bore no relationship to the actual information being conveyed. They used sarcasm, a mode in which the speaker says the exact opposite of what they mean, and expects the listener to decode the inversion through vocal tone, facial expression, and contextual awareness. They used idioms, fixed phrases whose meaning could not be derived from their component words. They told jokes, structured narratives, designed to produce an involuntary pleasure response called laughter. which Koramith had determined served as a collective stress management mechanism, a way of processing fear, pain, absurdity, and existential dread through shared vocalization. Koramith, who spoke 19 languages fluently, was drowning in a language that seemed to change its own rules depending on who was speaking, to whom, and about what. But his real crisis was not linguistic. It was something else entirely. He had encountered a human crew member walking through the residential section with a large quadruped animal on a tethered lead. The animal had a broad head, a muscular body covered in short golden fur, a thick tail that swung back and forth in a rhythmic motion, and a wide mouth that hung open in what appeared to be a relaxed expression. It walked beside the human with easy familiarity, matching pace, occasionally pressing its body against the human's leg, in what Koramith recognized as an affiliative contact gesture. The human spoke to the animal in a high-pitched, affectionate vocal register that bore absolutely no resemblance to any other mode of human speech Koramith had observed. The human fed the animal scraps from their own meal plate. The human scratched the animal's head with their fingers and called it a good boy, a designation that Koramith initially interpreted as a rank or honorific, before realizing it was an expression of emotional approval and bonding. He checked the species file. The animal was called a dog. It was a domesticated descendant of a creature called a wolf, which the file described as one of the apex pack predators of the human homeworld. Koramith read the domestication history 3 times to make certain he had understood correctly. Over the course of roughly 15,000 years, humans had taken a wild predator, a creature that hunted in coordinated packs, using pursuit and exhaustion strategies, possessed powerful jaws capable of crushing the bones of large prey animals, and was built for endurance, aggression, and lethal efficiency. And they had systematically, deliberately, through countless generations of selective breeding and social conditioning, transformed it into a loyal, affectionate companion animal that craved human approval. They did not cage the wolf, they did not defang it, they did not break its spirit or diminish its capabilities. They kept its strength, its loyalty, its pack instinct, and its courage, and they redirected all of it toward a single purpose: devotion to them. Koramith added a single line to his running assessment file, and when he read it to me, his voice was very quiet. Human social bonding extends across species barriers through deliberate emotional engineering. They do not merely tame other organisms, they convert them. They identify the core behavioral drives of another species, the pack loyalty of the wolf, the territorial instinct, the desire for social belonging, and they reshape those drives to center on themselves. The original animal's capabilities are preserved. Its nature is not destroyed. It is redirected. He paused and looked at me, and I could see in his 4 eyes the reflection of a thought he did not want to complete, but could not stop. If they could do this to wolves, he said, they could do it to anything. Given enough time and enough patience, which they seem to have in terrifying abundance, humans could make anything in the galaxy love them, or fear them, or both, simultaneously. Late on the 20th night, alone in my quarters, I accessed the human military archive and opened a section I had been deliberately avoiding: nuclear weapons. I had seen the term referenced dozens of times in their historical files, but had not investigated further because something in the way other files referenced it, a kind of reverent gravity, a weight in the language, made me reluctant to look too closely. That night, I decided I had been a coward long enough. I spent the next several hours learning about the moment in human history when they unlocked the fundamental structure of matter itself. They discovered that the atom, the building block of everything that exists, contained within it an almost incomprehensible amount of energy, bound up in the forces that held its components together. They found a way to release that energy, and their very first application of this knowledge, the very first thing they did with the power to touch the foundations of physical reality, was to build a weapon. They built devices that could unleash atomic energy in a single catastrophic pulse, producing explosions that could level entire cities in seconds. The temperatures at the center of these detonations rivaled the surface of their own sun. The shockwaves flattened structures kilometers from the blast point. The radiation produced could poison the land and water for generations, making entire regions uninhabitable. They used 2 of these weapons on populated cities during the war I had read about on my first night. 2 cities, hundreds of thousands of lives. ended in a flash of light, brighter than anything their planet had ever produced. And then they built more. They built thousands more, tens of thousands. They refined them, made them more powerful, more efficient, more deliverable. They designed systems to launch them across continents in minutes, from underground silos, from mobile platforms, from submarines hidden beneath the oceans. Two rival factions of the same species, separated by political ideology and mutual suspicion, aimed these weapons at each other across the surface of their planet and held them there for decades. Each side possessed enough destructive power to end all complex life on their homeworld several times over. Mutual assured destruction, they called it. They even had an acronym for it. They reduced the end of their world to an acronym. And then they did something that, according to every predictive model of species behavior in the Council's database, should have been absolutely impossible. They did not use them. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, two groups of humans sat across from each other, each holding the trigger to their own extinction, each knowing that the other held an identical trigger, and they chose, every single day, every single hour, not to pull it. Not because the weapons did not work, they worked perfectly. Not because they lacked the will or the anger or the fear, they had all three in abundance. But because they understood, with perfect, agonizing clarity, what would happen if either side chose to act, and they decided, collectively and individually, that the unbearable tension of sustained restraint was preferable to the certainty of mutual annihilation. They lived with that tension for generations. They raised children in its shadow. They built their entire global political structure around managing it. And they endured. I set down the file and stared at the wall of my quarters for a very long time. The weapons were not the horror. I want the Council to understand this clearly. Any sufficiently advanced species can build weapons of mass destruction. The Korvathi had planet crackers that could shatter a world's crust. The Hruel had bioweapons that could sterilize entire ecosystems within a generation. Weapons were simply a matter of engineering and will. The horror was not the weapons. The horror was the restraint. Because restraint is not passive. Restraint is not the absence of action. Restraint is an active, ongoing, conscious choice, made in the full knowledge that the alternative is available at any moment. Every single day that the humans did not launch those weapons, they were choosing not to. And every single day, the possibility that they might choose differently remained, hanging over their civilization like a blade, and they lived beneath it, and went to work, and raised their families and composed music, and told jokes and fell in love, and did everything that living things do, all while knowing that the end of everything was one decision away. They do not break under that kind of pressure. They adapt to it. They normalize it. They make it part of their daily existence and keep going. And that is what Dosk was trying to tell me. That is what the 3 scout crews could not put into words. The danger of humans is not their capacity for violence. Every species has a capacity for violence. The danger is their capacity for choice. They can choose peace, and they can choose war, and they can live on the knife edge between the two for generations, without losing their balance. And if they ever choose to step off that edge in the wrong direction, nothing in this galaxy is prepared for what happens next. I opened my official log. Day 21. Cultural Compatibility Index Assessment. Data insufficient for preliminary rating. Extending observation period. I closed the log and opened my journal. I am no longer certain we are observing them, I wrote. I believe, increasingly, that they are observing us. Every piece of information they have shared, every door they have opened, every archive they have made available, has been a deliberate release. They are showing us exactly what they want us to see, and what they want us to see is everything. Because they are confident that knowing the full truth about them will not help us, and might, in fact, be the thing that ensures we never become a problem they need to solve. Everything changed on day 26. I was in the observation lounge with Yaneli, reviewing her latest analysis of human governance structures, when the alarms went off again. Not the amber drill lights, not the deep horn, something different. A sharp staccato pulse that cut through the air like a blade, fast and urgent, and edged with a frequency that made my teeth ache. The lighting shifted to deep red, a color that in human psychology is associated with danger, with blood, with the most primal alerts their nervous system can produce. Beckett appeared within seconds, moving fast, her face transformed. The easy warmth was gone. The friendly smile was gone. What replaced it was something cold and focused, and stripped of everything unnecessary, a face optimized for function. And in that moment I saw, for the first time, the predator that lived behind the diplomat. "Vrelix raiders," she said. "6 ships. They dropped out of slip space at the edge of the station's defensive perimeter 90 seconds ago." I knew the Vrelix, pirate clans from the outer territories, opportunistic raiders who preyed on isolated outposts, cargo convoys, and poorly defended colonial stations. They were violent, unpredictable, and indifferent to diplomatic convention. 6 ships was a significant raiding force, more than enough to overwhelm most council installations in this sector. My immediate instinct was to flee. My second instinct was to send a distress signal to the nearest council patrol fleet, which was, if I remembered correctly, at least 6 hours away at maximum speed. Beckett did neither of these things. She ushered my team into a reinforced safe room deep in the station's core, sealed the blast door behind us, and activated an array of internal monitors so we could observe what happened next from relative safety. Then she left. She moved toward the command deck at a pace that was not quite running, but contained none of the casual ease I had associated with her for 26 days. I watched her go. I watched the blast door seal behind her, with a sound like a tomb closing, and then I turned to the monitors. What I saw in the next 4 minutes disassembled every assumption I had built over 26 days of careful, professional observation. The station's hull began to open. Panels I had walked past 100 times, panels I had assumed were maintenance hatches, cargo bay doors, communication relay housings, and thermal regulation vents, slid apart to reveal weapons systems that had been embedded within the structure of the station itself, hidden in plain sight, integrated so seamlessly into the civilian architecture that 4 weeks of unrestricted access had not revealed a single trace of their existence. Railgun batteries the size of shuttlecraft extended from concealed housings along the station's spine, their electromagnetic coils already charged and glowing with contained power. Point defense networks materialized from what I had identified in my notes as communications arrays, each one an automated weapon platform capable of tracking and destroying incoming ordnance at ranges I could not believe. Missile pods emerged from compartments disguised as docking clamps and external cargo containers, their tubes already loaded, their targeting systems already locked. This station was not a diplomatic outpost. It had never been a diplomatic outpost. It was a fortress, wearing the skin of a diplomatic outpost, and the skin had just peeled away. On the command deck monitor, I watched Beckett take her position at the tactical station beside the station commander, a tall, lean officer named Captain Daniel Price, whose existence I had been only vaguely aware of until that moment. Price surveyed the tactical display with the same calm focus I had seen in Beckett's face, watched the 6 raider signatures closing on the station, and issued a single command. 2 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not clench his jaw. He did not brace himself. He just spoke, the way someone might ask for a cup of water. Weapons free. The station fired. 3 Vrelix ships ceased to exist in the first 90 seconds. The railguns punched through their hulls like needles through wet paper. Kinetic projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed, striking with enough force to shatter the raiders from bow to stern. The ships came apart in expanding clouds of debris and frozen atmosphere, their reactor cores breaching in brief, brilliant flares that lit up the tactical display like dying stars. The remaining 3 raiders, realizing far too late what they had engaged, attempted to break off and flee. They changed course. They pushed their engines to maximum. They ran. They did not make it. 2 human fast-attack corvettes, small, agile, heavily armed warships that had been running dark in the asteroid field surrounding the station, with their power signatures reduced to near zero, powered up their engines and moved to intercept the fleeing raiders. They had been out there the entire time, waiting, silent, positioned in the asteroid field before my team had even arrived at the station, 26 days ago. The humans had placed them there as part of a defensive plan that existed, fully formed and thoroughly rehearsed, long before the Vrelix had ever entered this sector. The corvettes closed on the fleeing raiders with predatory efficiency, and disabled them with precisely targeted strikes to their propulsion and weapons systems. Not destroyed, disabled. The distinction was deliberate. The entire engagement, from first shot to last, lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds. No human casualties. No damage to the station, not even a scratch on the hull. The ambient lighting shifted from red to standard white. The weapons systems retracted back into their concealed housings. The panels slid closed. Within 2 minutes, the exterior of the station looked exactly as it had before. A civilian diplomatic outpost, unremarkable and inoffensive. Beckett removed her tactical headset, rolled her neck to release tension, and asked the mess officer over the intercom whether dinner service would still be running on schedule. It would. I stood in the safe room, surrounded by my team, and felt the entire architecture of my understanding collapse and reform into something new and much more frightening. Dosk reviewed the tactical replay 7 times in the hours that followed. He identified every element of the human strategy with the grim, precise eye of a professional who recognizes mastery when he sees it, even when that mastery belongs to someone who is not his own kind. The corvettes had been pre-positioned. The weapons had been pre-loaded. The targeting solutions had been pre-calculated. The defensive plan had been in place since the station was built, probably since before the station was built, embedded in the original architectural blueprints. The humans had known, through intelligence channels and analysis methods they had never disclosed to us, that raider activity was probable in this sector. They had not warned the Council. They had not requested patrols. They had not asked for assistance. They had simply built a kill zone, staffed it with people who smiled and shook your hand and offered you whiskey, and waited. I asked Dosk how many other human stations he thought were configured like this. He looked at me with his heavy Kethvari eyes and said, with the absolute flatness of total certainty, all of them. But the battle was not the worst of it. The battle was just engineering, just reflexes, just the kinetic application of superior preparation. The worst part was what came after. The disabled raider ships contained survivors, Vrelic's crew members, injured and trapped in their crippled vessels, broadcasting distress signals on emergency frequencies. Standard Council doctrine in this situation was clear. A victorious force either left disabled enemies to expire naturally or finished them off to prevent future retaliation. It was practical. It was efficient. No species I had ever observed wasted resources on defeated enemies when those resources could be better allocated elsewhere. Beckett ordered rescue and recovery operations. Human boarding teams crossed the gap between the station and the disabled raiders in armored shuttles. They cut through the damaged hulls with precision tools, entered the wreckage, located wounded Vrelic's crew members, stabilized their injuries with field medical equipment, extracted them carefully from the debris, and transported them back to the station. The same medical bay where Dr. Garrett had saved the maintenance worker with the hole in his abdomen was now treating Vrelic's pirates who, less than an hour ago, had been attempting to kill everyone on board this station. Garrett and his team worked with the same focused professionalism they applied to their own people. They stabilized traumatic injuries, set broken limbs, administered pain relief, calibrated specifically for Vrelic's physiology, which meant they had studied Vrelic's biology in advance, which meant they had prepared for the possibility that they might one day need to heal the same enemies they were prepared to destroy. I found Beckett on the command deck after the recovery operations concluded and asked her the only question that mattered. Why? She looked at me for a long moment, and something moved across her face that I have spent weeks trying to name. It was not pity. It was not superiority. It was not even compassion, exactly. It was something older and heavier, a weariness that seemed to belong not just to her, but to her entire species, as though the answer to my question was something every human carried, and none of them could put down. They are not a threat anymore, she said, and we do not kill people who are not a threat. The final piece fell into place with a sound like a lock engaging. Humans do not lack the capacity for total destruction. They possess it in abundance beyond anything the Council has catalogued. They do not lack the willingness to deploy it. They had just demonstrated that willingness with brutal, devastating, 4-minute efficiency. But in the moment of their greatest power, standing over defeated enemies who had tried to end their lives, they chose mercy. Not because they were naive, not because they were weak, Not because they failed to understand the strategic argument for elimination, because they were strong enough to afford mercy, because mercy to them was not a concession of weakness. It was a demonstration of strength so absolute that it could spare its enemies and still feel no vulnerability. And if they ever decided they could no longer afford that mercy, if they ever concluded that the calculus had shifted and restraint was no longer the optimal strategy, then every species in this galaxy was in a degree of danger that no threat model had ever accounted for. That evening, Pelith locked herself in her quarters and refused to come out. I stood outside her door and asked what had happened. She told me, her voice muffled by the sealed door, about something she had found in the human biological database that afternoon, something she had been cross-referencing with the combat data from the Vrelix engagement. She called it the immune system. The human body, she said, at the cellular level, wages constant, unending, relentless war against microscopic invaders. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungal agents, foreign organisms that attempt to colonize, corrupt, or destroy human tissue from within. The human body identifies these threats autonomously, deploys specialized cellular defenders that hunt and destroy the invaders, and if it survives the engagement, it remembers. It catalogs the defeated enemy. It builds permanent, targeted defenses against that specific threat, so that the same attack can never succeed again. Every human alive is a walking battlefield. Their bodies fight, adapt, learn, and prepare, every second of every day, without conscious effort, without rest, without cessation. They do not have a war footing, she said through the door, her voice thin and strained, in a way I had never heard from her before. They do not have a peace footing. They are always at war. War is their default biological state. It is their cellular reality. Peace is just the scale of conflict dropping below the level of conscious awareness. They are never not fighting something. I did not write an official log entry that night. I could not bring myself to compress what I had witnessed into the sterile language of compatibility metrics and institutional assessment. I opened my private journal and wrote the only thing that felt true. The Council asked us to determine if humans are compatible with galactic civilization. The question is wrong. The question was always wrong. The correct question is whether galactic civilization is compatible with humans. And standing here tonight, in the aftermath of a battle that lasted less time than a meal and was followed by the rescue of the very enemies who started it, I do not know the answer. I do not think anyone does. Day 30, final rotation. My team assembled in the docking bay at the scheduled departure time, and I barely recognized them. These were not the same 5 people who had boarded Station Jericho 30 days ago. Those people had been confident, professional, composed. The beings standing before me now carried something different in their posture, in their eyes, in the way they held themselves. Dosk had not spoken in 2 days. He stood near the airlock with his arms folded across his broad chest, his gaze fixed on some middle distance that did not correspond to anything in the physical room. The warrior who had survived 63 combat engagements looked like a soldier who had finally met something he could not fight. Yaneli clutched her data tablet like a shield, scrolling through her notes compulsively, reviewing and re-reviewing her findings, as though repetition might make them less alarming or reveal some interpretive error that would let her dismiss what she had learned. There was no error. Koromith stood apart from the group, his body angled slightly away from the nearest human crew members, flinching almost imperceptibly every time one of them laughed, reacting to the sound of human amusement, the way one might react to the rumble of distant seismic activity. Pelith had resumed her duties after her breakdown, but she maintained a careful physical distance from every human she encountered, keeping at least 2 arm lengths of space between herself and the nearest one at all times, as though proximity itself carried risk. And then there was me, 140 years of field observation, 39 species, the most decorated cultural assessor in the Bureau's history. I stood in that docking bay feeling something I had never experienced in my entire career. Not fear, not awe, something deeper and quieter and more permanent than either. Insignificance. The understanding that everything I thought I knew about the hierarchy of civilizations, about the predictive models of cultural development, about the boundaries of what a species could be and do, was incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. The framework I had spent my career building was not large enough to contain what I had witnessed here. Humans did not break the framework. They simply existed outside it, in a space my models had never accounted for, because no one had ever imagined that such a space could be occupied. Beckett escorted us to the airlock personally. She was warm. She was kind. She was exactly the same person she had been on the day we arrived. And I now understood that this consistency was not a performance. It was real. The warmth was real, the kindness was real, the friendliness was real, and so was everything else. The hidden weapons, the concealed warships, the 4-minute destruction of 6 enemy vessels, the cellular-level biological warfare, the millennia of imagined alien invasions, the nuclear arsenals pointed at their own kind. All of it was real, simultaneously, in the same people, without contradiction. She brought gifts. A bottle of amber liquid she called whiskey, which she said was made from fermented grain and aged in wooden containers for years. A hand-painted star chart showing the constellations as they appeared from the surface of Earth, their homeworld, with each constellation labeled in their language, and accompanied by the myths they had invented to explain the patterns. And a children's book, a small illustrated volume about a dog that waited every day at a train station for its owner to come home from work. A story about loyalty and patience and love that transcended the ability to speak. She handed these to us with genuine affection and told us she hoped we had enjoyed our stay, that we were welcome back any time, that it had been a pleasure getting to know us. She meant it. Every word. And I realized, standing there holding a bottle of alien liquor and a picture book about a faithful dog, that the sincerity might be the most horrifying element of all. Because it meant that the violence and the mercy, the weapons and the art, the readiness for war, and the capacity for tenderness were not separate things being held in tension. They were the same thing, the same species, the same heart. Humans did not compartmentalize their nature the way other species did. They did not keep their capacity for destruction in one place, and their capacity for beauty in another. Both lived in the same space, used the same hands, occupied the same moment, and the humans moved between them with a fluidity that suggested they saw no boundary at all. As our ship undocked and pulled away from Station Jericho, Beckett transmitted a final data package. Unsolicited, unrequested. The package was enormous, far larger than anything we had received during our stay, and when I opened the transmission manifest and scanned its contents, I stopped breathing. It contained the complete, unredacted archive of human art, music, literature, philosophy, and poetry. Thousands of years of creative output, billions of individual works. The entire aesthetic and intellectual heritage of a species that had spent its existence building and destroying and rebuilding and reaching for something it could never quite name, but never stopped pursuing. I opened a file at random. It was a piece of music. A composition for a single instrument called a piano, written by a human named Debussy, over a century before they ever left their homeworld. The piece was called Clair de Lune, which Koramith, sitting quietly beside me, translated in a whisper as moonlight. I listened to it once, alone in the observation compartment of our departing ship, watching Station Jericho shrink to a bright point against the infinite dark. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. I want you to understand what that means. I have witnessed the crystalline songstorms of the Palani, which are considered the highest form of artistic expression in the known galaxy. Harmonic compositions performed by 1,000 voices, in perfect synchronization, that can move entire audiences to spontaneous weeping. I have heard the resonant frequencies of the Korvathi Dawn Chorus, overtone singing that vibrates at wavelengths designed to stimulate the deepest emotional centers of the listener's brain. I have stood in the chamber of a Yenthian queen and felt music that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated in my bones. None of it prepared me for what a single human, sitting alone at a wooden instrument, pressing keys with 10 fingers, could create with nothing but an understanding of sound and a soul full of longing. I listened to the piece 3 times. By the second listening, I was weeping. Not from sadness, not from fear. From the sheer, incomprehensible scope of a species that could build weapons capable of ending worlds, and compose something like moonlight with the same hands, the same minds, the same boundless, terrifying, beautiful capacity for creation and destruction, and everything between them, and beyond them, and beneath them. I could not reconcile it. I do not think anyone can. I do not think we are meant to. I think the inability to reconcile it is itself the lesson, that humans cannot be reduced to a single truth because they contain all truths simultaneously, and the attempt to simplify them is the first step toward underestimating them, which is the last mistake any species should ever make. 6 days later, I stood at the podium in the Grand Council chamber. All 312 member species were represented, their delegates arranged in the vast semicircular gallery that rose from the speaking floor in tiered rows. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy, the full weight of interstellar civilization gathered in one room. The bureau director asked me for the Cultural Compatibility Index rating, standard procedure, a number between 1 and 100, a clean, clinical assessment that could be entered into a database and cited in committee meetings for the next century. I stood in silence for a long time. I could feel my team behind me. I could feel the weight of the chamber's attention. I could feel the distance between what I was expected to say and what I needed to say, and I watched that distance grow wider with every second, until it was too vast to bridge with anything but the truth. Then I told them everything. I did not read from the official report. I set it aside and spoke directly. I told them about the gymnasium, where humans voluntarily subject themselves to physical punishment for no reason other than to maintain readiness for threats that may never materialize. I told them about the emergency drill, where an entire station, including its children, transitions to full combat readiness in 4 minutes because they practice for catastrophe the way other species practice for holidays. I told them about the dog, the wolf they domesticated through 15,000 years of patient, deliberate emotional engineering, the predator they did not break but converted. I told them about the nuclear weapons, the moment when humans held the power to end their own world and chose, day after day, decade after decade, not to use it. I told them about the fiction, the centuries of imagined alien invasions they had already fought and won in their minds before they knew we existed. I told them about the battle, 4 minutes of devastating precision that annihilated half a raider flotilla, followed immediately by the rescue and medical treatment of the surviving enemies. I told them about the immune system, the biological truth that every human being alive is engaged in perpetual microscopic warfare from the moment of birth until the moment of death. And then I told them that the Cultural Compatibility Index was meaningless. The framework, I said, was designed to measure whether a candidate species can adapt to existing galactic norms, whether they can integrate into our institutions, conform to our protocols, adopt our ways of conducting interstellar affairs. I told the chamber, with absolute certainty, born of 30 days of observation and 140 years of professional experience, that humans will not integrate. They will not conform. They will not adapt to the galaxy. The galaxy will adapt to them. It is only a matter of time. The chamber erupted. Delegates from dozens of species shouted for clarification, for context, for some reassurance that I was exaggerating. Several demanded that humanity's petition be denied outright and their borders sealed. Others proposed quarantine measures, containment protocols, permanent surveillance networks. A Korvathi delegate, his scales flushed dark with agitation, suggested preemptive military action, while humanity's fleet was still small enough to be manageable. The noise was deafening. 312 species, all of them afraid, all of them trying to process the same information I had spent 6 weeks processing, all of them arriving at the same terrible conclusion and desperately searching for a way around it. Then the Kethvari delegate spoke. His name was Vorath. He was a senior military commander, decorated in campaigns I had only read about, respected across the council as one of the finest strategic minds of his generation. He turned to Dosk, his fellow Kethvari. The chamber fell quiet. The Kethvari are a warrior species. Their assessment of military matters carries weight that transcends politics and diplomacy. When a Kethvari speaks about threats, every species listens, because the Kethvari have spent their entire history understanding threats at a level no other species has matched. Vorath asked Dosk directly whether his military assessment supported my conclusions. The chamber held its breath. Dosk stood. He was the largest being in the room by a significant margin, a career warrior from a civilization that measured a person's worth by the battles they had survived and the scars they carried as proof. He looked at Vorath. He looked at the chamber. He let the silence build. And then, in a voice that carried to every corner of that enormous space, flat and final, and devoid of anything except absolute conviction, he said 5 words. "Do not provoke the humans." He sat back down. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It filled the chamber like water filling a basin, rising from the floor to the ceiling, pressing against the walls, compressing the air until breathing felt like effort. 312 species sat in that silence and understood, each in their own way, each through the lens of their own history and biology and fears, that the galaxy had changed and was not going to change back. The vote was called within the hour. Humanity's petition for full membership in the Galactic Council was approved. Unanimously. Every single delegate from all 312 member species voted in favor. Not because they wanted humans as partners, not because they believed humans would be good galactic citizens, not because they admired human culture, or valued human friendship, or saw strategic advantage in alliance. Because every delegate in that chamber, independently, without consultation, arrived at the same inescapable conclusion. It was better to have humans inside the council, where they could be watched, included, consulted, and kept close, than outside the council, where they could not be watched at all. The motion passed in perfect silence. No applause, no celebration, no ceremonial remarks, no speeches about unity and shared purpose. Just 312 species, exhaling at the same time, united by a single shared understanding. They had just voted to bring the most dangerous thing in the galaxy into their house, because the alternative, leaving it outside in the dark, was infinitely worse. I returned to my quarters after the vote. I sat at my desk. I opened my private journal to the first entry, the 2 words I had written on the night we arrived at Station Jericho. They remember everything. I stared at those words for a long time. Then I added a final line beneath them. And now, so will we. I closed the journal. I opened a formal communication channel to the Bureau of Cultural Integration and submitted my resignation from field observation, effective immediately. I cited personal reasons. I did not elaborate. No one asked me to. I think they knew. I think anyone who looked at me, at my team, at the way we carried ourselves now, hunched and quiet and permanently alert, could see that something fundamental had shifted inside us and was not going to shift back. I poured a glass of the whiskey Commander Beckett had given me. It was harsh and warm, and it burned going down in a way that was almost pleasant, a small, controlled fire that lit up my throat and settled in my chest like a hot stone. I poured a second glass. Through the viewport of the council station, I could see the distant stars of the outer galactic arm, scattered across the dark like dust on black glass, and somewhere among them, too faint and too far to distinguish from a billion identical points of light, was the small yellow star called Sol, an ordinary star. A main-sequence dwarf, unremarkable in every measurable way. There was nothing about it. No spectral anomaly, no gravitational signature, no radiation pattern that would cause a passing astronomer to give it a second glance. It was the kind of star you flew past without noticing, a background detail in the vast architecture of the galaxy. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the viewport, turned off the lights, and sat alone in the dark, holding a glass of human whiskey, thinking about a species that looked into the void of space and did not flinch. A species that took wolves and made them loyal. That took atoms and made them weapons. That took weapons and chose not to use them. That took enemies and showed them mercy. That took sound and shaped it into moonlight. A species that was coming now, into the full light of galactic civilization, not because we had invited them, not because we had decided they were ready, but because they had decided it was time. And we, all 312 of us, the ancient and the young, the predators and the hive minds, the conquerors and the diplomats, had looked at them and understood, with a clarity that would keep us awake for generations, that we had never been the ones making the decisions. We had only ever been the ones reacting, and the humans, patient and ready and endlessly, impossibly capable, had been waiting for us to realize it. They ask me if humans are dangerous. I have been asked this question 47 times since my return. By colleagues, by delegates, by intelligence officials, by my own family members, late at night, when the children are asleep, and the adults can speak freely about the things that keep them staring at the ceiling in the dark. Every time, I give the same answer. Number. Dangerous is a word for things you can quantify. Dangerous is a predator with sharp teeth. Dangerous is a weapon with a known yield. Dangerous is a storm with a predictable path. You can measure dangerous. You can model it. You can prepare for it. Humans are not dangerous. Humans are inevitable.